A golden haze bathes the sprawling lawns of Fair Lane, the Ford family estate in Dearborn, Michigan, where once the hum of innovation seemed to echo from every brick. Built as a monument to a new American century, its limestone walls and towering chimneys promised an eternal legacy. Yet today, ivy creeps through cracked windows, and the grand halls stand silent, haunted by whispers of a darker truth. How did a palace born of genius become a tomb for ideals so bitterly flawed? In the early 20th century, Henry Ford was not merely a man, he was a force, a titan who reshaped the world with the turn of a wheel. His Model T didn't just roll off assembly lines, it carried America into modernity, stitching together a nation with ribbons of asphalt. But beneath the sheen of progress burned a restless hunger, not for wealth, but for control. Ford craved a fortress, a sanctuary where his vision could reign unchallenged, far from the prying eyes of a society he both built and distrusted. Fair Lane was to be that bastion, a 300-acre dream carved from the Michigan wilderness, where he could escape the chaos of his own creation. Yet even as he laid the first stone, shadows of resentment and suspicion clung to him, ghosts of a mind that saw enemies in every corner, real or imagined. The construction of Fair Lane, begun in 1913, was less a project than a crusade. Ford's obsession pulsed through every detail, as if the house itself could bend the world to his will. Architect William Van Tine labored under his exacting gaze, crafting a 56-room colossus of limestone and slate, its design a defiant blend of prairie school simplicity and industrial might. Entire forests were felled for its beams, while rare marble was shipped across oceans to line its corridors. Landscape architect Jens Jensen sculpted the grounds into a living masterpiece, with winding rivers and gardens that seemed to whisper of Eden. But nature itself resisted. Workers battled floods and unforgiving soil, as if the earth knew this dream was built on unsteady ground. Hundreds of hands toiled for years, their sweat mixing with Ford's relentless ambition, until Fair Lane rose as a challenge to time itself. This wasn't just a home. It was a war against impermanence waged with steel and stone. Inside those walls, the golden hour of Fair Lane shimmered briefly, a mirage of perfection. In the early years, the estate gleamed with promise. Its vast ballroom hosted orchestras, while dignitaries and industrial barons sipped champagne beneath Tiffany chandeliers. The air thrummed with the clink of crystal and the murmur of power, as Ford surveyed his kingdom with a quiet, steely pride. Yet behind the velvet curtains, cracks spiderwebbed through the fantasy. His wife Clara wandered the endless halls, her laughter often swallowed by the oppressive quiet of rooms too vast for intimacy. Their son, Edsel, grew up in the shadow of a father whose genius was matched only by his coldness, a boy caught between admiration and unspoken dread. Below stairs, servants shivered in drafty quarters, their world a stark contrast to the gilded excess above. The house was a marvel, yes, but it was also a cage, trapping its inhabitants in a splendor that felt more like a sentence than a gift. Even in those early days of glory, an unease settled over Fair Lane, as if the walls had seen too much. Ford's mind, so brilliant in its mechanical precision, harbored darker currents, ideas that festered in the privacy of his study. From this very estate, he would later unleash a venom that stained his name, a series of writings so toxic they reached across oceans to fuel hatred. But in those first moments of triumph, as sunlight streamed through stained glass onto polished floors, no one could foresee the storm brewing within the man at the heart of it all. The gardens bloomed, the river flowed, and Fair Lane stood as a testament to what one man could build when driven by equal parts vision and paranoia. The seeds of downfall were sown even as the mortar dried. Ford's need for control, so evident in every meticulously placed stone, extended beyond architecture to the very fabric of his beliefs. What he couldn't know was that his fortress, meant to shield his legacy, would one day become a mirror reflecting its deepest flaws. The world outside shifted, wars loomed, ideologies clashed, and the very innovations Ford pioneered began to outpace him. Within Fair Lane, the laughter of guests would soon fade, replaced by the heavy tread of solitude. The grand staircase, once a stage for arrivals, would bear witness to departures no one could predict. Today, Fair Lane lingers as a relic, its grandeur dimmed by decades of neglect. Once a symbol of boundless ambition, it now sits behind locked gates, its gardens overgrown, its windows staring blankly at a world that has moved on. Some rooms have been restored, open to curious eyes, but the essence of what it was, a fortress of one man's dreams and demons, remains elusive, locked in the past. Houses, unlike people, do not forget. They hold the weight of every whispered secret in their bones. And so, as dusk falls over Dearborn, the silhouette of Fair Lane cuts a lonely figure against the sky, its chimneys reaching for a glory long extinguished. The air within Fair Lane seemed to hum with a peculiar tension in those early years, as if the very walls anticipated the weight of secrets they would soon bear. Beyond the manicured lawns and the serene flow of the Rouge River, carved by Jens Jensen's masterful hand, Henry Ford's mind churned with ideas far darker than the industrial marvels that had made him a household name. In the privacy of his oak-paneled study, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound books and the faint scent of machine oil that clung to him like a shadow, he began to weave a narrative not of progress, but of suspicion. This was not the Ford of assembly lines and affordable dreams. This was a man consumed by unseen enemies, crafting a legacy that would taint the very foundation of his limestone fortress. The study at Fair Lane was a sanctuary within a sanctuary, a room where the outside world was barred by heavy doors and thicker convictions. Here, in the flickering glow of a desk lamp, Ford pored over articles and pamphlets, his pen scratching out theories that festered like rot beneath the estate's polished surface. He saw conspiracies in every corner of society. Bankers, politicians, entire communities he believed sought to undermine the America he had helped forge. His obsession took form in ink, as he funded and directed the Dearborn Independent, a newspaper that became a mouthpiece for venomous ideas. From 1920 onward, its pages spewed anti-Semitic rhetoric, accusing Jewish people of manipulating the world's wealth and power, a fabricated menace that Ford, in his paranoia, swore was real. The words flowed from this very mansion, carried on the winds of his influence, staining the air of Fair Lane with a bitterness no garden could mask. The irony was as sharp as the winter winds that howled through Michigan. Fair Lane had been built as a monument to innovation, a place where Ford could escape the chaos of the world he'd revolutionized, yet it became the crucible for some of his most destructive thoughts. As gardeners tended to roses and mechanics fine-tuned the estate's cutting-edge hydroelectric system, Ford sat in solitude, penning articles that would later be compiled into The International Jew, a text so insidious it reached the hands of tyrants across the sea. The walls of Fair Lane, adorned with intricate woodwork and imported marble, stood witness to this quiet corrosion, their beauty a stark contrast to the ugliness taking root within. Every stroke of his pen seemed to echo through the empty corridors, a soundless drumbeat of a legacy veering into shadow. Outside, the estate remained a vision of perfection, its 1,300 acres a testament to Ford's ability to bend even nature to his will. Guests still arrived in gleaming automobiles, marveling at the sunken gardens and the artificial river that meandered through the grounds as if painted by a divine hand. But behind the velvet curtains, a different story unfolded. Clara Ford, ever the steadfast companion, sensed the growing darkness in her husband's musings, though her gentle protests were often met with the steely resolve of a man who believed he alone saw the truth. Their son, Edsel, barely out of boyhood in those early 1920s, felt the weight of his father's expectations and obsessions pressing down like the heavy slate roof above. The boy's eyes, often fixed on the horizon beyond Fair Lane's gates, betrayed a longing for escape, a silent plea to be free of a name that was both a crown and a chain. The servants, too, whispered of a change in the air, their voices hushed as they polished silver in the cavernous kitchens below. They saw the stacks of newspapers piling up in the master's study, the late-night pacing that left scuff marks on the parquet floors. They felt the chill of a house that, despite its electric warmth and modern marvels, grew colder with each passing year. Fair Lane was no longer just a home. It had become a vault for ideas that festered in silence, ideas that would soon spill beyond its walls to poison the world outside. The chandeliers above glittered with the same brilliance, but their light seemed dimmed by the shadows cast from within. What they couldn't know, as they tended to their duties or strolled through the estate's endless gardens, was how far Ford's words would travel. The articles born in that quiet study would cross oceans, finding eager readers in places as distant as Berlin, where they fueled a hatred that would engulf millions. Even as Fair Lane stood as a bastion of American ingenuity, its master unknowingly sowed seeds of division, that would bear bitter fruit long after the last guest had departed its halls. The mansion's grandeur, with its towering chimneys and sweeping vistas, masked a growing stain, one that no amount of limestone or gold leaf could conceal. And so, as the 1920s unfolded, Fair Lane remained a paradox, a palace of progress built by a man whose vision was increasingly clouded by prejudice. The river flowed on, indifferent to the turmoil brewing within the estate's walls, its waters reflecting a sky that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The gardens bloomed in defiance of the darkness, their colors a fleeting reminder of what Fair Lane had once promised to be. But silence fell, where music once ruled, and the echoes of Ford's pen scratched louder than any orchestra, a sound that would reverberate far beyond the gates of Dearborn. The air at Fair Lane carried a deceptive calm in those early 1920s, as if the estate itself were holding its breath, waiting for the storm its master was brewing. Beyond the meticulously groomed lawns and the serene, sculpted curves of the Rouge River, a shadow deepened within the limestone walls. In the heart of the mansion, Henry Ford's study became a crucible of unrest, its heavy oak doors shutting out the world while letting loose a poison that would seep far beyond Dearborn. The faint scratch of his pen against paper was a sound no one heard, yet it reverberated through the empty halls, a prelude to a legacy far darker than the industrial triumphs etched into his name. That study, with its towering bookshelves and the ever-present tang of machine oil clinging to Ford's coat, was a fortress within a fortress. Under the dim glow of a brass lamp, late into the night, Ford hunched over his desk, his mind a labyrinth of suspicion and control. He saw threats in every shadow of society, bankers pulling invisible strings, politicians bowing to hidden masters, entire communities he believed conspired to unravel the America he had forged with steel and sweat. From this room, starting in 1920, he poured his paranoia into the Dearborn Independent, a newspaper he funded and shaped, turning it into a weapon of words. Its pages accused Jewish people of orchestrating global control, a sinister fantasy that Ford, in his isolated brilliance, swore was truth. Each article, penned or dictated in the quiet of Fair Lane, drifted out like ash from a smoldering fire, tainting the air of a home built to symbolize progress. The bitter irony hung heavy over the estate. Fair Lane had risen as a monument to innovation, a refuge from the chaos of a world Ford had revolutionized with the Model T. Yet it became the birthplace of ideas that corroded the very ideals it was meant to embody. While gardeners pruned roses under Jensen's masterful design, and engineers marveled at the estate's hydroelectric marvels, Ford sat alone, crafting articles that would later coalesce into The International Jew, a text so toxic it would echo in the halls of hatred across continents. The walls of Fair Lane, adorned with hand-carved woodwork and marble shipped from distant shores, bore silent witness to this decay, their elegance a cruel contrast to the venom taking root within. Every line he wrote seemed to pulse through the mansion's corridors, an unseen tremor beneath the polished floors. Beyond the study's walls, the estate gleamed with an untouched perfection that masked the growing rot. Visitors still arrived in polished cars, their gasps of awe echoing as they strolled through sunken gardens and past the artificial river that wound like a dream through the grounds. The ballroom's Tiffany chandeliers cast golden light on rare occasions, reflecting a splendor that seemed untouchable. But behind the velvet curtains, a different reality simmered. Clara Ford, the quiet anchor of the family, felt the shift in her husband's soul. Her soft words of concern often met with the unyielding gaze of a man convinced he alone saw the world's hidden machinations. Her footsteps echoed in the vast halls, a lonely sound in a house too large for warmth, as she grappled with a darkness she could neither name nor banish. Their son, Edsel, still young in those early years of the decade, bore the weight of his father's obsessions like a physical burden. Growing up amid Fair Lane's endless rooms, he wandered beneath the shadow of a name that was both a privilege and a prison. His eyes often lingered on the world beyond the estate's iron gates, a silent yearning for freedom from the expectations and the unspoken dread that clung to every corner of his home. The tension between father and son was a quiet undercurrent, felt in the stiff silences at dinner, where the clink of silver on porcelain was louder than any conversation. Fair Lane, for all its grandeur, was becoming a cage, its beauty a veneer over a family fracturing beneath the strain of one man's unrelenting vision. Below stairs, the servants sensed the change too, their hushed voices barely audible as they polished silver in the cavernous kitchens. They noticed the stacks of newspapers accumulating in the master's study, the restless pacing that scarred the parquet with invisible marks. They felt the chill of a house that, despite its electric heating and modern wonders, grew colder with each passing season. Fair Lane was no longer merely a home. It had morphed into a repository for ideas that festered in secrecy, ideas that would soon spill beyond its 1,300 acres to poison the broader world. The chandeliers still sparkled, but their light seemed muted, as if dimmed by the shadows cast from within the man who had built this empire of stone and steel. What no one within those walls could foresee was the reach of Ford's words, scrawled in the solitude of his sanctuary. The writings born at Fair Lane would travel far beyond Michigan, finding fertile ground in distant lands, where they would stoke fires of hatred that consumed millions. Even as the estate stood as a beacon of American ingenuity, its master unwittingly planted seeds of division that would outlast the roses in Jensen's gardens. The mansion's towering chimneys and sweeping vistas concealed a growing stain, one that no amount of wealth or limestone could erase. And so, as the 1920s pressed on, Fair Lane remained a paradox, a palace of progress shaped by a man whose vision was increasingly shrouded in prejudice. The river flowed on, indifferent to the turmoil within, its surface mirroring a sky that seemed to darken with each passing day. The gardens bloomed defiantly, their vibrant hues a fleeting echo of what the estate had once aspired to represent. But silence fell, where music once ruled, and the scratch of Ford's pen grew louder than any melody, a sound that would resonate far beyond the gates of Dearborn, carrying a weight the world was not yet ready to bear. The air at Fair Lane carried a deceptive stillness in those early 1920s, as if the sprawling estate itself were bracing for the unseen tempest its master was unleashing. Beyond the pristine lawns and the serene, winding Rouge River, shaped by Jens Jensen's visionary hands, a shadow grew within the limestone fortress. In the heart of the mansion, Henry Ford's study became a chamber of quiet discord, its thick oak doors sealing off the world while releasing a poison that would drift far beyond Dearborn's borders. The faint scratch of his pen on paper, though unheard by most, seemed to reverberate through the vast halls, a harbinger of a legacy far darker than the industrial miracles that had carved his name into history. This study, with its towering shelves of leather-bound tomes and the lingering scent of machine oil that clung to Ford like a second skin, was a stronghold within a stronghold. Under the muted glow of a brass desk lamp, late into the Michigan nights, Ford bent over his work, his mind a maze of suspicion and iron-willed control. He saw invisible enemies lurking in every facet of society, bankers weaving secret webs, politicians as pawns of unseen forces, entire communities he believed sought to dismantle the America he had built with sweat and steel. From this very room, beginning in 1920, he channeled his paranoia into the Dearborn Independent, a newspaper he funded and molded into a vessel of vitriol. Its pages accused Jewish people of orchestrating a global conspiracy, a fabricated threat that Ford, in his isolated genius, swore was undeniable truth. Each word, written or dictated in the stillness of Fair Lane, floated out like embers from a hidden blaze, tainting the air of a home meant to stand as a beacon of progress. The bitter irony hung as heavy as the winter fog over the estate. Fair Lane had been erected as a testament to innovation, a sanctuary from the chaos of a world Ford had reshaped with the Model T, yet it became the cradle of ideas that corroded the very principles it was built to embody. While gardeners tended to roses under Jensen's masterful design, and engineers marveled at the estate's cutting-edge hydroelectric system, Ford sat in solitude, crafting articles that would later be bound into the International Jew, a text so venomous it would echo in the darkest corners of the world. The walls of Fair Lane, adorned with intricate woodwork and marble hauled from distant lands, stood as silent sentinels to this decay, their elegance a cruel foil to the ugliness festering within. Every line he penned seemed to pulse through the mansion's endless corridors, an invisible tremor beneath the polished floors, as if the house itself could feel the weight of what was being created. Beyond the study's heavy doors, the estate shimmered with a perfection that veiled the growing rot. Visitors still arrived in gleaming automobiles, their murmurs of awe echoing as they wandered through sunken gardens and past the artificial river that meandered like a dream through the grounds. The ballroom's Tiffany chandeliers cast golden light on rare evenings, illuminating a splendor that seemed untouchable, but behind the velvet curtains a different reality simmered. Clara Ford, the quiet pillar of the family, sensed the shift in her husband's spirit. Her gentle words of unease often met with the unyielding stare of a man convinced he alone saw the world's hidden truths. Her footsteps echoed through the cavernous halls, a solitary sound in a house too immense for warmth, as she wrestled with a darkness she could neither fully grasp nor dispel. Their son, Edsel, still a young man in those early years of the decade, carried the burden of his father's obsessions like a physical weight. Growing up amid Fair Lane's sprawling rooms, he roamed beneath the shadow of a name that was both a privilege and a shackle. His gaze often drifted to the horizon beyond the estate's iron gates, a silent longing for release from the expectations and the unspoken dread that permeated every corner of his home. The tension between father and son was a muted undercurrent, felt in the strained silences at dinner where the clink of silver against porcelain drowned out any attempt at connection. Fair Lane, for all its grandeur, was morphing into a prison, its beauty a fragile mask over a family fracturing under the strain of one man's relentless vision. Below stairs, the servants felt the change as well, their whispers barely audible as they polished silver in the sprawling kitchens. They noticed the growing piles of newspapers in the master's study, the restless pacing that left unseen marks on the parquet floors. They sensed the chill of a house that, despite its electric warmth and modern marvels, grew colder with each passing season. Fair Lane was no longer just a residence. It had become a vault for ideas that festered in secrecy, ideas that would soon spill beyond its 300 acres to poison the world outside. The chandeliers still gleamed above, but their light seemed muted, as if dimmed by the shadows cast from within the man who had built this empire of stone and steel. What no one within those walls could predict was the reach of Ford's words, scrawled in the isolation of his sanctuary. The writings born at Fair Lane would travel far beyond Michigan, finding eager ears in distant lands, where they would stoke fires of hatred that consumed millions. Even as the estate stood as a symbol of American ingenuity, its master unwittingly sowed seeds of division that would outlast the blooms in Jensen's gardens. The mansion's towering chimneys and sweeping vistas hid a growing stain, one that no amount of wealth or limestone could wash away. And so, as the 1920s unfolded, Fair Lane remained a paradox, a palace of progress shaped by a man whose vision was increasingly clouded by prejudice. The river flowed on, indifferent to the turmoil within, its surface reflecting a sky that seemed to darken with each passing day. The gardens flourished defiantly, their vibrant colors a fleeting echo of what the estate had once aspired to be. But silence fell, where music once ruled, and the scratch of Ford's pen grew louder than any melody, a sound that would resonate far beyond the gates of Dearborn, bearing a weight the world was not yet prepared to shoulder. The air within Fair Lane held a deceptive tranquility in those early 1920s, as if the sprawling estate itself could sense the storm brewing beneath its limestone skin. Beyond the manicured lawns and the gentle sculpted curves of the Rouge River, a shadow lengthened in the heart of the mansion. In Henry Ford's study, a fortress within a fortress, thick oak doors shut out the world while unleashing a poison that would seep far beyond Dearborn's quiet borders. The faint scratch of his pen on paper, though unnoticed by the household, seemed to echo through the cavernous halls, a somber prelude to a legacy far darker than the mechanical triumphs that had etched his name into the fabric of America. This study, with its looming shelves of leather-bound volumes and the persistent whiff of machine oil that trailed Ford like a ghost, was a sanctum of obsession. Under the soft, flickering light of a brass desk lamp, deep into the Michigan nights, Ford hunched over his desk, his mind a tangled web of suspicion and unyielding control. He saw threats in every corner of society, bankers orchestrating unseen schemes, politicians as mere puppets. Entire communities, he believed, conspired to erode the America he had built with grit and innovation. From this room, starting in 1920, he poured his paranoia into the Dearborn Independent, a newspaper he bankrolled and shaped into a vessel of venom. Its pages accused Jewish people of masterminding global dominance, a baseless menace that Ford, in his secluded brilliance, insisted was real. Each word, scrawled or dictated in the hush of Fair Lane, drifted out like smoke from a hidden fire, tainting the air of a home meant to embody progress. The bitter irony clung to the estate like a shroud. Fair Lane had been raised as a monument to ingenuity, a refuge from the chaos of a world Ford had transformed with the Model T, yet it became the womb of ideas that corroded the very ideals it was meant to uphold. While gardeners trimmed roses under Jens Jensen's masterful vision, and engineers tinkered with the estate's pioneering hydroelectric system, Ford sat alone, penning articles that would later form the International Jew, a text so toxic it would reverberate through history's darkest corridors. The walls of Fair Lane, graced with hand-carved woodwork and marble shipped across oceans, stood as mute witnesses to this rot, their beauty a harsh contrast to the malice taking root within. Every stroke of his pen seemed to tremble through the mansion's endless passageways, an unseen quake beneath the gleaming floors, as if the house itself bore the burden of what was being forged. Beyond the study's heavy doors, the estate shimmered with a perfection that masked the creeping decay. Guests still arrived in polished cars, their whispers of wonder carrying as they strolled through sunken gardens and past the artificial river that wound like a fantasy through the grounds. The ballroom's Tiffany chandeliers spilled golden light on rare occasions, illuminating a grandeur that seemed eternal. But behind the velvet curtains, a grimmer tale unfolded. Clara Ford, the quiet bedrock of the family, felt the shift in her husband's soul. Her soft pleas often met with the steely resolve of a man who believed he alone glimpsed the world's hidden machinations. Her footsteps rang through the vast halls, a lonely sound in a house too immense for tenderness, as she grappled with a darkness she could neither name nor banish. Their son, Edsel, still young in those early years of the decade, bore the weight of his father's fixations like a millstone. Growing up amid Fair Lane's sprawling chambers, he wandered beneath the shadow of a name that was both a crown and a fetter. His eyes often strayed to the world beyond the estate's iron gates, a quiet yearning for escape from the expectations and the unspoken dread that saturated every nook of his home. The strain between father and son was a silent undercurrent, felt in the taut silences at dinner, where the clatter of silver on china drowned out any hope of warmth. Fair Lane, for all its splendor, was becoming a cage, its elegance a brittle veneer over a family splintering under the pressure of one man's unyielding will. Below stairs, the servants sensed the change too, their murmurs barely audible as they polished silver in the sprawling kitchens. They noticed the growing stacks of newspapers in the master's study, the restless pacing that scarred the parquet with invisible traces. They felt the chill of a house that, despite its electric heat and modern wonders, grew colder with each passing season. Fair Lane was no longer merely a home. It had morphed into a crypt for ideas that festered in secrecy, ideas that would soon spill beyond its 300 acres to poison the wider world. The chandeliers still sparkled overhead, but their light seemed dimmed, as if dulled by the shadows cast from within the man who had built this empire of stone and steel. What no one within those walls could foresee was the reach of Ford's words, scratched out in the solitude of his refuge. The writings born at Fair Lane would journey far beyond Michigan, finding fertile soil in distant lands, where they would fuel fires of hatred that devoured millions. Even as the estate stood as a pillar of American innovation, its master unwittingly planted seeds of discord that would outlast the blooms in Jensen's gardens. The mansion's soaring chimneys and sweeping vistas concealed a growing blemish, one that no wealth or limestone could cleanse. And so, as the 1920s pressed forward, Fair Lane remained an enigma, a palace of progress shaped by a man whose vision was increasingly shrouded in prejudice. The river flowed on, indifferent to the turmoil within, its surface mirroring a sky that seemed to darken with each passing day. The gardens thrived defiantly, their vivid hues a fleeting reminder of what the estate had once aspired to represent. But silence fell, where music once ruled, and the scratch of Ford's pen grew louder than any melody, a sound that would echo far beyond the gates of Dearborn, carrying a burden the world was not yet ready to bear. The quiet of Fair Lane in the early 1920s was a fragile illusion, a thin veneer over the storm gathering within its limestone walls. Beyond the pristine expanse of lawns and the tranquil winding Rouge River, shaped by Jens Jensen's poetic touch, a darkness deepened in the heart of the estate. In Henry Ford's study, a sanctuary sealed by heavy oak doors, a poison was brewing, one that would escape the confines of Dearborn and stain the world beyond. The soft scratch of his pen, unnoticed by the household, seemed to ripple through the vast empty halls, a ghostly omen of a legacy veering far from the industrial brilliance that had immortalized his name. This study, with its high shelves of leather-bound books and the faint, persistent trace of machine oil that shadowed Ford's every step, was a vault of obsession. Beneath the dim flicker of a brass lamp, late into the frigid Michigan nights, Ford bent over his desk, his mind a churning sea of mistrust and iron resolve. He saw enemies in every unseen corner of society, bankers spinning secret webs, politicians as pawns of hidden powers, entire communities he believed plotted to unravel the America he had forged with relentless innovation. From this very room, beginning in 1920, he funneled his paranoia into the Dearborn Independent, a newspaper he financed and molded into a blade of words. Its pages accused Jewish people of orchestrating a sinister global control, a fabricated threat that Ford, in his isolated genius, insisted was undeniable. Each line, written in the stillness of Fair Lane, drifted outward like embers from a smoldering pyre, tainting the air of a home built to herald progress. The cruel irony draped over the estate like a heavy fog. Fair Lane had been constructed as a monument to human achievement, a haven from the chaos of a world Ford had revolutionized with the Model T, yet it became the birthplace of ideas that eroded the very principles it stood for. While gardeners nurtured roses under Jensen's masterful eye and engineers fine-tuned the estate's groundbreaking hydroelectric system, Ford sat in solitude, crafting articles that would later congeal into The International Jew, a text so venomous it would resonate through history's bleakest chapters. The walls of Fair Lane, adorned with exquisite woodwork and marble hauled from distant shores, bore silent witness to this corrosion, their splendor a stark mockery of the hatred taking root within. Every stroke of his pen seemed to shudder through the mansion's endless corridors, an imperceptible quake beneath the polished floors, as if the house itself felt the weight of what was being unleashed. Beyond the study's fortified doors, the estate gleamed with a deceptive perfection that hid the spreading decay. Visitors still rolled up in polished automobiles, their breaths of awe echoing as they wandered through sunken gardens and past the artificial river that snaked like a dream through the grounds. The ballroom's Tiffany chandeliers spilled golden light on scarce evenings, casting a glow over a magnificence that seemed untouchable. But behind the velvet curtains, a grimmer story unfolded. Clara Ford, the quiet strength of the family, sensed the growing shadow in her husband's mind. Her gentle concerns often met with the cold, unyielding gaze of a man convinced he alone saw the world's hidden machinations. Her footsteps reverberated through the cavernous halls, a solitary echo in a house too vast for intimacy, as she wrestled with a darkness she could neither define nor drive away. Their son Edsel, still a young man in those early years of the decade, carried the burden of his father's fixations like a stone in his chest. Growing up amid Fair Lane's sprawling chambers, he drifted beneath the weight of a name that was both a privilege and a cage. His gaze often lingered on the horizon beyond the estate's iron gates, a silent ache for freedom from the expectations and the unspoken dread that seeped into every corner of his home. The strain between father and son was a quiet current, felt in the tense silences at dinner, where the clink of silver against porcelain drowned out any semblance of connection. Fair Lane, for all its opulence, was becoming a prison, its beauty a fragile mask over a family fracturing beneath the pressure of one man's unrelenting will. Below stairs, the servants felt the shift as well, their whispers barely audible as they polished silver in the sprawling kitchens. They noticed the mounting stacks of newspapers cluttering the master's study, the restless pacing that left unseen scars on the parquet floors. They sensed the chill of a house that, despite its electric warmth and modern marvels, grew colder with each passing season. Fair Lane was no longer just a residence. It had transformed into a tomb for ideas that festered in secrecy, ideas that would soon spill beyond its 2,300 acres to poison the world outside. The chandeliers still shimmered above, but their light seemed dulled, as if muted by the shadows cast from within the man who had built this empire of stone and steel. What no one within these walls could anticipate was the reach of Ford's words, etched in the isolation of his refuge. The writings born at Fair Lane would travel far beyond Michigan, finding eager minds in distant lands, where they would kindle flames of hatred that consumed millions. Even as the estate stood as a symbol of American innovation, its master unwittingly sowed seeds of division that would outlast the petals in Jensen's gardens. The mansion's towering chimneys and sweeping vistas concealed a growing scar, one that no amount of wealth or limestone could erase. And so, as the 1920s marched on, Fair Lane remained a paradox, a palace of progress shaped by a man whose vision was increasingly veiled in prejudice. The river flowed on, indifferent to the turmoil within, its surface mirroring a sky that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The gardens bloomed defiantly, their vibrant colors a fleeting whisper of what the estate had once promised to be. But silence fell, where music once ruled, and the scratch of Ford's pen grew louder than any melody, a sound that would echo far beyond the gates of Dearborn, bearing a weight the world was not yet prepared to shoulder. The years following the early 1920s at Fair Lane carried a creeping unease, as if the very foundation of the estate could feel the cracks widening beneath its master's legacy. The once vibrant gardens, so meticulously crafted by Jens Jensen, began to show the first signs of overgrowth, their edges softening as if retreating from the bitterness that seeped from within the limestone walls. In Henry Ford's study, the scratch of his pen had slowed, but the damage of his words in the Dearborn Independent had already spiraled beyond the gates of Dearborn, igniting fires of hatred in far-off lands. The air in the mansion grew heavier, laden with the weight of a name that now bore a dual shadow, one of genius and one of prejudice that no apology, issued under pressure in 1927, could fully erase. The halls of Fair Lane, once alive with the murmur of guests and the clink of champagne flutes, fell into a deeper stillness as the decade waned. The ballroom, with its Tiffany chandeliers, stood empty more often than not, the golden light they once cast, now a memory trapped in dust motes drifting through silent air. Clara Ford paced the endless corridors, her presence a quiet ache in a house that felt more like a mausoleum with each passing day. Her husband's public retraction of his venomous writings, forced by lawsuits and dwindling alliances, did little to lift the pall that had settled over their home. Behind the velvet curtains, she whispered to herself of a time when these walls echoed with hope, not regret, but her words were swallowed by the vastness of rooms too large for solace. Edsel Ford, now stepping into adulthood, bore the brunt of a legacy he hadn't chosen. The weight of his father's name, and the stain it now carried, pressed down on him as he walked the grounds, his footsteps crunching on gravel paths that wound through gardens losing their luster. He had watched, powerless, as the ideas born in his father's study spread their poison, and though he disagreed with the venom, the shadow of filial duty bound him to silence. His own dreams for the Ford empire clashed with the old man's iron will, and the tension between them reverberated through Fair Lane's walls like a low, unending hum. The estate, once a symbol of boundless possibility, now felt to him like a gilded trap, its beauty a cruel reminder of a family fracturing under the strain of unspoken truths. Below stairs, the servants moved with a quieter tread, their once lively chatter reduced to hushed murmurs as they dusted furniture that seldom saw use. They had seen the newspapers disappear from the study after the apology, but the chill lingered, as if the walls had absorbed too much to ever feel warm again. They spoke in low tones of the outside world, where Ford's writings had fueled hatreds they could scarcely comprehend, and of the whispers that even the mighty industrialist's contrition couldn't silence. The kitchens, once bustling with preparations for grand banquets, now prepared meals for a dwindling household, the clatter of pots a faint echo of livelier days. Fair Lane was shedding its vibrancy, its pulse slowing as if it, too, bore the burden of the ideas it had unwittingly birthed. The estate's grandeur began to fray at the edges, mirroring the unraveling of the man who had built it. The artificial river still flowed, its gentle current a stark contrast to the turmoil that had once poured from Ford's pen, but even its waters seemed to carry a melancholy ripple. The towering chimneys, once symbols of industrial might, loomed over grounds where weeds crept into once pristine flower beds, as if nature itself sought to reclaim what hubris had carved out. Visitors became scarce, the iron gates closing more often than they opened, and the world outside shifted. New wars, new ideologies, and new voices rising to drown out the echoes of Ford's past venom. What they couldn't know, in those waning years of the 1920s and into the 1930s, was how deeply those words had already burrowed into history, their consequences unfurling in places Fair Lane's architects could never have imagined. The mansion stood as a paradox, its limestone facade unyielding even as the spirit within it faltered. The sunken gardens, though neglected, still held traces of Jensen's genius, their overgrown paths a testament to a vision that outlasted its caretaker's zeal. Upstairs, in rooms where laughter had once rung out, curtains hung heavy with dust, their rich fabrics fading as if mourning the dreams they once framed. Ford himself, retreating further into the fortress of his own mind, seemed a diminished figure against the vastness of his creation, his steps slower on the grand staircase that had once heralded his triumphs. The walls had seen too much, paranoia penned in secret, a family strained to breaking, a legacy tainted by words that refused to die. And as the 1930s bled into the 1940s, Fair Lane's silence grew thicker, a quiet that spoke of endings rather than beginnings. The river wound on, its surface reflecting a sky bruised with the weight of a world at war, a conflict touched by the very hatreds Ford's writings had once fanned. The estate, though still standing, felt like a relic of a bygone ambition, its sprawling acres a canvas of faded glory. In the quiet of a late afternoon, with the sun dipping low to cast long shadows across the overgrown lawns, a single bird perched on a cracked windowsill, its fleeting song the only sound where music once ruled, a fragile note against the enduring weight of memory. The twilight of Fair Lane's story casts a long, somber shadow over Dearborn, as the estate stands today, a ghostly sentinel of a bygone era, caught between ruin and reluctant revival. Once a fortress of ambition, its limestone walls now bear the scars of time, ivy curling through broken panes where golden light once spilled from Tiffany chandeliers. The sprawling 2,300 acres, though partially restored under the care of preservationists, still whisper of neglect. Overgrown paths in Jens Jensen's gardens twist like veins, leading nowhere, as if the land itself mourns the dreams it was forced to cradle. The iron gates, rusted in places, creak open for curious visitors, but the air within remains thick with a silence that feels ancient, a hush that clings to the bones of a home built on both genius and poison. Walking through the grand entrance, one can still trace the ghost of Henry Ford's footsteps on the worn parquet floors, each scuff a reminder of a man whose vision reshaped the world, yet whose darker obsessions reshaped his legacy in ways he could never have foreseen. The ballroom, though swept clean for occasional events, feels hollow, its vast ceiling looming over empty space where orchestras once played for industrial titans. A faint draft seeps through unseen cracks, carrying the chill of decades spent in solitude, as if the house itself shivers at the memory of venom penned in its study. The river outside, still flowing as it did a century ago, reflects a fractured sky, its waters indifferent to the weight of secrets that once poured from these walls into a world unprepared for their consequence. Upstairs, the bedrooms stand as time capsules, their faded wallpapers peeling like old skin, revealing the raw plaster of forgotten promises. Clara Ford's presence lingers in the delicate embroidery of a chair, untouched by restoration, as if her quiet grief still hovers over the endless corridors she once paced. Edsel's room, stripped of personal traces, feels heavier still, a space where a son's dreams were smothered beneath the shadow of a father's unrelenting will, a tension that no amount of polished wood can erase. The windows, some boarded, others staring blankly at the overgrown lawns, frame a view of a Michigan that has moved on, leaving Fair Lane to grapple with a past it cannot shed. Every creak of the floorboards seems to murmur of a family undone, of laughter drowned by the scratch of a pen that echoed far beyond these walls. Below, in the servants' quarters, the air is damp with the scent of mildew, a stark contrast to the opulence above, yet even here, the walls seem to remember. The narrow staircases, once trod by unseen hands bearing silver trays, now lead to empty rooms where whispers of unease must have passed between those who polished the facade of a fracturing dynasty. A rusted sink, a cracked mirror, these relics speak of lives lived in the shadow of grandeur, of eyes that saw the stacks of newspapers grow in the study, of ears that heard the restless pacing of a man consumed by unseen enemies. The basement's chill seeps into the bones, a reminder that Fair Lane was never just a palace. It was a crypt for ideas that festered in silence, their echoes reaching places as distant as war-torn Europe, where they fueled horrors no restoration can undo. Outside, the artificial river winds through the estate, its gentle current a cruel mirror to the turmoil it once bordered. The sunken gardens, though partially revived, still bear patches of wild growth as if nature insists on reclaiming what hubris carved out. A lone bench, weathered and splintered, sits beneath a gnarled oak, overlooking a vista that once dazzled visitors, but now feels like a painting left to fade. The towering chimneys, symbols of industrial might, pierce a sky that seems to press down with the weight of history, their silhouette a stark outline against the horizon. Fair Lane, even in its partial resurrection as a museum and event space, cannot escape the melancholy that clings to its every stone, a sadness woven into the very mortar that holds it together. What remains of the Ford family's fortress is more than a structure. It is a vessel of memory, a keeper of truths both triumphant and tragic. The restoration efforts, though earnest, cannot scrub away the stain of words that drifted from this place to poison distant minds, nor can they fully revive the laughter that once danced through its halls. The estate stands as a paradox, a monument to progress and a mausoleum for prejudice, its beauty forever tinged with loss. Houses, unlike their makers, endure with a stubborn silence, holding within their walls the weight of every whispered regret, every broken dream, every echo of a pen that scratched out division. And so, as dusk settles over Dearborn, the last light of day catches on Fair Lane's highest window, a fleeting glint against the creeping shadows. The river murmurs on, its surface a quiet mirror to the bruised sky above, while a single withered leaf falls onto the cracked stone of the grand terrace. It rests there unmoving, a fragile remnant in a place where splendor and sorrow are forever entwined, a silent witness to a legacy that time will neither fully bury nor forgive.